So then it was released and the media was there waiting. I told the story to the media, it became a very big deal. Several months later, I was prosecuted, but in the meantime, a whole movement had formed around this, and really a lot of people grew up in that Salt Lake area and kind of came out of the woodwork then and said, we've kind of been waiting for this sort of thing. Like, we've been waiting for a movement that had boldness and confrontation in it. And so we formed an amazing community called Peaceful Uprising, and then I ended up being charged with 2 felonies. That became a very long, drawn-out legal process where the government kept delaying my trial over and over. Like the Gulf oil spill happened in that time, and my trial was supposed to be a few weeks later.
Were they trying to generate more press? Was that their goal?
No, they just didn't want to put me on trial, for standing in the way of thoughtless and irresponsible oil drilling at a time when like 1 million gallons an hour were spewing out of the Gulf, and they were destroying an entire ecosystem. So they realized, things like that kept happening. There was also an oil spill a few months after that, right in the heart of Salt Lake City, that a pipeline broke on a stream, which then flowed into the park in the middle of Salt Lake, in the biggest park, and the lake just filled with oil, and everyone around there got sick. And again, it was an inconvenient time to put me on trial. So it was
your trial in Salt Lake City?
Yeah, so things kept getting delayed, and finally, in the spring of 2011, I went on trial. I was extremely restricted in what I was allowed to present to the jury, and wasn't allowed to talk about climate change or anything like that. And so I ended up being convicted and then sentenced to 2 years in prison. But throughout all of that, I continually got a larger and larger national platform in the climate movement.
So what were the things you couldn't say in the trial?
Yeah, so the basic case that I wanted to be able to make is called the necessity defense, which is the argument that one breaks a law in a technical way in order to prevent the greater harm of something else, that there's a necessity to act. And the classic example of that is that if a house is on fire and there's a kid inside, and you break down the door to go rescue that kid, that if you're charged with breaking and entering because you kicked that door down, there's a defense that you were preventing a greater harm of that kid's life than breaking the door jam. And so that has been applied to civil disobedience cases in certain times. So in the fall of 2008, I was inspired by a case that happened in the UK, and it was called the Kingsnorth 6, which was a Greenpeace action that shut down a coal-fired power plant, and they used this defense because it comes from English common law, and they actually won. They had Dr. James Hansen on the stand testifying about climate change, and the jury of 12 random people ruled that by shutting down that plant for the day, they actually prevented greater harm than they caused to the plant. And so I saw the potential for trials like that to be a tool of social change, and to show that while it might be a minority of folks who are taking the kind of bold actions that we see in the climate movement, that if you have a jury then that substantiates the justifications for their actions, that shows that it's not just sort of a fringe minority, which is, I think, really hard to show in other ways. So that was the case that I wanted to be able to make. And unfortunately, there's a lot of precedent opposed to activists being able to present a full and open necessity defense in trial. So it's rare in general, and in my particular case, my judge was a pretty extreme ideologue. He hadn't really had a court trial career. He had a career in Washington. He was Orrin Hatch's chief of staff. And
enough said.
He was appointed directly to the federal bench from Orrin Hatch's office because of Hatch's influence on the Judiciary Committee. So he made it pretty clear where he stood. So he shut down pretty much any discussion of anything other than what happened in that auction room on that day.
Now, due to your actions, it turned out the auction ended up being thrown out by the Obama administration. Is that right? So what was the ultimate outcome of your action in that specific those specific parcels?
In some ways, it's still up in the air. The first thing that happened was even before any charges were pressed against me. As soon as Ken Salazar, the new Secretary of the Interior, came into office, his first act was actually to invalidate that auction. And they admitted that they didn't follow their own rules in holding that auction. So they rescinded not only the parcels that I won, but most of the other parcels that were auctioned off there as well. And they kind of focused on the rules that they didn't follow in terms of procedure of notifying the National Park Service and stuff like that. The one that certainly concerned me was that there was actually a law, an executive order that went into effect in 2001 in the Department of the Interior, requiring all agencies under that department to weigh the impacts of climate change in any of their decisions, particularly decisions around fossil fuel extraction. And that went into effect right when Bruce Babbitt was leaving office at the end of the Clinton administration. And obviously it was completely ignored for the whole 8 years of the Bush administration. So things were rescinded then, and then that land kind of became in that limbo state that a lot of our public lands are in, and especially a lot of the Bureau of Land Management lands, where it's not exactly protected, and it's sort of like awaiting development or extraction. And it was in that limbo for a while, but it also brought enough attention to the way that auction process works and our fossil fuel leasing program on our public lands that it did invite a whole kind of investigation into how that might need to be changed. And so the most recent development is that for the Moab district of the Bureau of Land Management, they initiated a new master leasing plan that looks at all the lands in that district and decides what are appropriate for drilling. And that actually makes most of the lands that I bid on off limits for any future drilling.
Excellent.